From above, it looks like a perfect star pressed into empty water. Sharp points, straight lines, geometry so clean it feels unreal. Up close, it's an isolated wound of stone and timber where supply boats arrive late, men sweat through fever, and the dead are carried to shallow graves because there's nowhere else to put them. This is the star fort that should not exist. Not because it's impossible, but because the cost of building it was the kind of story nobody wanted to keep. I'm James. Before we step onto that shoreline, you need to understand what makes star forts feel wrong to modern eyes. Their geometry is too readable. Even ruined, the shape survives. And when the shape survives better than the paperwork, people start treating the silhouette like evidence, especially the Tartaria crowd, who see the same angles and symmetry and call it proof of a forgotten system. The truth is darker and simpler. Clean geometry doesn't require magic. It requires planning, and the kind of work that breaks people quietly. Out past the comfortable map of America, a low chain of islands sits like debris in the sea. No city, no farms, no second chances, just wind, salt, and a shoreline that chews through wood and iron as if it's bored. The supply schooner shows up as a speck first, then as a shape heavy with brick and barrel staves. The men on deck are already sick of the voyage. Stale water, spoiled food, the constant slap of waves that makes sleep feel like punishment. When they finally see the fort site, nobody cheers. The place doesn't look like progress. It looks like exile. A young private named Thomas Keane steps off the boat and immediately regrets the air. It's thick with salt and rot, and the sun hits like a hammer. The ground isn't really ground, more like coral and sand that refuses to be stable. Every step feels like the island is trying to roll him back into the water. Inland, the construction yard is a scatter of tents, stacked brick, and timber frames that warp as soon as they dry. There's no shade that lasts. There's no fresh water you can trust. And there's a rhythm to the place that Keane learns in the first hour. Unload fast, carry faster, don't ask what happens when the boats stop coming. An engineer officer stands over a table with paper weighted by stones. He doesn't speak like a man on an island. He speaks like a man in a city, as if the lines on the page are more real than the mud under their boots. He points to a crisp star outline and talks about angles, bastions, and perfect fields of fire, the kind of language that turns human bodies into numbers that move. Then he points at the shoreline and says, "Start cutting." Men dig trenches for foundations that keep trying to fill themselves. They haul brick in chains, shoulder to shoulder, the line never stopping because stopping means the next man has to carry 2 loads. They set timbers that don't sit right because nothing sits right here. The mortar dries too fast some days and won't set at all on others. Everything is a fight against environment and time. By the 3rd week, the fort starts to show its shape. Triangles and straight runs that look almost insulting in a place this chaotic. The geometry is the only thing that feels controlled, and that's why it becomes a kind of obsession. A corner that's off by inches gets corrected while men cough blood into rags. The first death isn't cinematic, it's typical. A pallet of brick is being swung in from a barge. The tagline is wet. The wind shifts. The load rotates a few degrees, slow and heavy, and a corporal steps in the wrong place because he's looking at the hook, not at his own feet. The pallet clips a stack. The stack shudders, and bricks start to fall the way rain falls. Fast, straight, uncaring. One brick hits his shoulder, another catches his skull at the edge of his cap. He drops without a scream, like someone turned him off. The men around him freeze for half a second. Then they do what the island teaches them to do. They move the danger first. "Clear the swing," someone yells. They drag him by the arms out of the drop zone. His head lolls. Blood mixes with sand, turning it dark. A medic kneels, checks for breath, looks up once at the engineer officer as if waiting for permission to call it. Permission doesn't come as kindness. It comes as an instruction. "Take him to the shade," the officer says, "and get that brick stack reset. We're behind." Behind what, Keane thinks? Behind the weather? Behind the sea? Behind the fact they're building a perfect star in the middle of nowhere? Later, they bury the corporal in ground that doesn't hold a grave properly. There's no clean cemetery, no carved markers, just a place the men agree not to walk over unless they have to. The island eats names faster than it eats wood, and the record of what happened becomes thin immediately, because the only paper that matters here is the paper that keeps money coming and orders flowing. The dead don't help the schedule, the dead don't help the story, so the dead become lost, the way tools get lost, the way time gets lost, the way men get lost when the boats don't arrive. That night, Keen sits outside his tent listening to the sea smash itself against coral. In the distance, lanterns move along the half-built lines of the fort, tracing the star points like someone drawing over the same shape again and again to make it real. He realizes something that will make sense later, when people argue about Tartaria and impossible geometry. The geometry is real. It's right there in plain sight. What's missing is the human accounting. Who got sick? Who fell? Who was crushed? Who simply stopped waking up when the heat and the isolation finally won? And when the paperwork goes quiet, the star starts speaking louder than the men who built it. Subscribe and hit like, because once the supply boats stop coming on time, the fort's geometry stays perfect, while everything human starts to fail. The first month teaches them the island's real rule. Everything you need is always one storm away from not arriving. The schooner that was supposed to return in 10 days doesn't show for 3 weeks. The men stop pretending it's normal on day 12, when the water ration gets cut and the bread starts tasting faintly green at the edges. On day 15, the cooks scrape weevils out of the flour and bake anyway. By day 18, nobody jokes about it. I need to explain what logistics means in a place like this, because on paper it sounds clean. Bricks, lime, timber, iron, food, medicine. Delivered on schedule. On the island it's a single thread. One delayed boat and the thread snaps. Mortar can't be mixed right. Tools break and stay broken. Sick men don't get replaced. And when you're isolated, sickness doesn't just spread. It settles in, like humidity. Thomas Keene learns the first symptom before he learns the name. It starts with gums. A man named O'Malley, older, loud, always the first to volunteer, sits on an ammo crate and presses his tongue against his teeth like he's checking for rot. When he spits, the sand turns pink. He tries to laugh it off, but his eyes look afraid. 2 days later, O'Malley can't lift a brick without shaking. The medic calls it bad blood, then quietly starts pulling men from the line one by one. He's out of quinine before the second week ends. He's out of clean bandages before the third. He starts boiling rags in a pot, wringing them out, and pretending that makes them new. The work continues because the engineer officer's map doesn't have room for pause. He stands over his table with the paper weighted by stones and keeps pointing at corners like the corners are the only thing keeping them alive. That angle has to match, he says, as if geometry is a moral test. You drift here, the whole face is wrong. Men drag a string line through mud and coral grit. Stakes go in. Survey marks get checked and rechecked. A star fort is unforgiving that way. Every point echoes the next. If one bastion is off, the entire shape starts lying. And the shape can't lie, not on an island where the only proof of order is the order itself. The second death comes at the waterline. A skiff is being unloaded in choppy surf. Barrels roll, men wade in up to their thighs, boots filling with salt water, hands numb from brine and strain. A private slips on slick coral and drops the end of a rope. The barrel swings, catches another barrel, and suddenly the whole load shifts like it wants to escape the island. Sergeant Harlan Briggs, hard-faced, sunburned, raw, the kind of man who turns fear into shouting, steps in to steady it. He grabs the rope, braces his boots, and takes the full pull in his arms. The rope jerks. Harlan goes forward into the water, not falling so much as being taken. A wave slaps over his head. Another follows. 2 men lunge, but the surf is already dragging him sideways into deeper chop. They haul him out a minute later, coughing seawater, eyes wide, shaking like a man who's been reminded how thin his body is. He lives. But that night his cough turns wet. By morning he's fever-hot, sweating through his shirt, mumbling nonsense like his brain is drifting out with the tide. The medic sits with him and keeps wiping his forehead as if wiping can change the island. Harlan dies on the 3rd day, not on the shoreline but in a tent that smells like salt and sickness. That's how tallies get blurred. The death isn't dramatic enough to become a story. It's a chain of ordinary failures. Slip, wave, fever, ending quietly behind canvas. The burial ground grows without calling itself a burial ground. They don't build headstones. They don't have time, and time is the currency this place hoards. They mark graves with driftwood and broken stakes, things the sea will steal back. The island takes the markers the way it takes everything else. Keene walks past the graves on his way to the line and starts recognizing the shapes of the mounds. Some are narrow, some are longer, like 2 men were laid together to save digging. Nobody says symmetry. They say the back sand, like it's just another supply pile. On the work face, the fort begins to look eerily clean. The walls rise in straight runs that don't belong to nature. The bastions sharpen into points. The ditches deepen. The angles stay crisp even when the men building them don't. A corporal drops from heat while carrying a timber brace. He just folds, knees buckling, face hitting sand. 2 men drag him into shade, pour the last of their water into his mouth, and go right back to lifting because the brace still has to be set before the tide shifts. A mason splits his hand on a jagged brick edge. The wound looks small. 2 days later it's swollen, angry, streaked red up the arm. The medic cuts it open with a knife that's been boiled too many times, and the man screams so loudly the gulls scatter. He loses the hand anyway. Then he loses the fever fight a week after that, eyes staring at nothing, body shrinking under blankets as if the island is pulling him inward. If you're wondering why Tartaria communities obsess over places like this is the fuel. Perfect geometry and imperfect records. When names disappear and only the shape remains, people start reading meaning into the shape. They start treating symmetry as proof of a forgotten method, because symmetry is visible from the sky. Graves aren't. Keen sees it one evening when the light goes low and the half-built fort casts long, star-shaped shadows over the sand. The angles are so precise they look printed. Men move along the lines like insects along a diagram, small and replaceable. Beyond the work, the burial mounds sit in uneven rows, their driftwood markers already leaning, already fading. The fort will outlive them. The star will stay sharp long after the names have softened into nothing, and that is exactly why, years from now, people will stare at the geometry and argue about lost civilizations, while the real darkness is simpler. You can build a perfect star with enough planning. The harder trick is keeping the people alive long enough to finish it. The 3rd month is when the island stops feeling temporary. Tents rot at the seams, wood warps, iron blooms orange with rust. Men stop counting days and start counting arrivals, because the fort doesn't measure time in calendars anymore. It measures time in whether the sea allows you to be resupplied. When the schooner finally appears again, it doesn't bring relief. It brings arithmetic. Half the barrels are spoiled. The lime is damp and clumped. The medical chest is light. The pay chest is late. Men line up anyway, not because they believe in the fort, but because belief is optional and hunger isn't. Here's the part that matters if you're trying to understand the geometry. Star forts are not built freehand. They're built like instruments. Strings, stakes, chains, angles checked until the shape becomes inevitable. That's why the silhouette looks eerie from above. It wasn't discovered. It was enforced. Keen gets pulled off hauling duty and put on a survey line because his hands are steady, and he can follow orders without talking back. He expects it to be easier work. He's wrong. The survey crew walks the half-formed perimeter with a chain and a sighting instrument perched on a tripod. The engineer officer, Captain Renwick, sharp-eyed, sunburned into bitterness, taps the paper plan with a gloved finger and treats the island like the island should obey. "This face is drifting," he says, and points at a run of wall that looks straight to any normal eye. "If it drifts here, the bastion doesn't match. If the bastion doesn't match, your lines don't overlap. If your lines don't overlap, the whole point of the fort is gone." He doesn't have to say what happens if the point is gone. Everyone already knows. The Empire doesn't forgive expensive mistakes. It replaces men. A mason crew is ordered to tear down 2 days of work because an angle is off by inches. The masons stare, exhausted, then start pulling brick because refusing would only change the kind of pain they experience. They rebuild the corner in heat that makes men dizzy and in salt air that makes wounds fester. One of the masons, O'Malley, gum still bleeding, breath sour with sickness, leans on his trowel too long. Rennick sees it and assumes laziness, not disease. "You rest when the wall is true," he snaps. O'Malley tries to stand straight. His knees shake. He takes one step, then drops like his bones have been hollowed out. The men nearest him don't rush immediately. They glance at the officer first because the officer has turned every human impulse into a question of permission. "Carry him to the shade," Rennick says, already looking back through the instrument, "and relay that line." The fort begins to feel like a diagram drawn over living bodies. Accidents keep happening, and now they happen inside the geometry itself. A ditch is cut deeper, cleaner, more precise, its edges sharp enough to look like it was carved by a blade. A man slips while hauling a timber brace across a narrow crossing plank. He drops into the cut, lands wrong, and the sound of the break is loud enough that gulls lift from the shoreline. He doesn't die, he just becomes useless. They pull him out with a rope, leg bent in a direction legs don't bend. His face is white with shock, lips trembling like a child's. The medic splints it with warped boards and cloth that used to be a shirt. Infection arrives anyway. In this heat and salt, infection is faster than empathy. A week later, the man is still alive, sweating through fever, begging for water in a voice that doesn't sound like him. Then he stops begging. Then he stops moving. The burial ground gains another mound, and the records get thinner. The quartermaster's ledger stays neat, but it becomes vague. Names are misspelled, dates are missing. Causes of absence compress into soft phrases that can cover anything. Ill, lost, sent away, did not report. Men who attempt to leave by skiff are later described as deserted. Men who vanish after a storm are lost to the sea. Men who die after weeks of fever are simply no longer on the roster. Keane hears two soldiers arguing by the cook tent, one insisting they should write down names properly, the other laughing without humour. "What difference does it make?" the second one says. "The fort will be here. We won't." Then the storm hits. It doesn't announce itself with drama. It arrives as a pressure change, then a wind that turns the air into grit. Tarps rip free, tents collapse, waves slap the shoreline hard enough to pull stacked timber toward the water. The half-built walls take the beating like teeth in a mouth. Some hold, some crack, some shed mortar like scab. A supply skiff flips at the landing. Two men are dragged under before anyone can grab a rope. One comes up coughing and wild-eyed. The other doesn't come up until hours later when the sea gives him back face down and swollen. The next morning Rennick walks the damaged perimeter, eyes red from sand, and doesn't talk about the dead. He talks about the angles. "The point is blunted," he says, staring at a bastion corner that has slumped. "Fix it." Men rebuild with hands split open from wet brick. They rebuild while sick. They rebuild while the burial ground grows, and the geometry becomes sharper because suffering has nothing else to cling to. When everything human is dissolving, food, health, names, the shape is the only thing that stays obedient. This is exactly why the Tartaria people love places like this. They don't need to invent the star is real. They don't need to prove the symmetry is visible from the sky. What they need is a gap, thin records, missing names, unmarked graves, and the fort gives them that gap for free. Keane sees it at dusk when the light goes low and the walls cast long, perfect shadows. The points of the star stretch across sand like a stamped symbol, too precise for the chaos that built it. Men move along the lines in small clusters, lanterns bobbing, coughing into sleeves. Behind them, driftwood grave markers lean at odd angles, already fading. The fort is becoming the only story that survives, and the darker truth is settling in. The geometry isn't hidden. The cost is. The inspection rumour hits the island like a second fever. A government ship is coming, Captain Rennick says. A visit. A report. A verdict that will decide whether more supplies and more money keep flowing, or whether the fort becomes an embarrassing scar nobody wants to talk about. The men don't cheer. They just look at the half-finished angles and understand what that kind of pressure always means. Nights will be added, rest will be cut, and anything human will be treated like a delay. Rennick walks the perimeter with the plan in his hand, and points at the same thing he always points at. "The points must read clean," he says. "If the geometry is wrong, everything is wrong." So the geometry becomes urgent. Work moves into the dark. Lanterns swing from stakes. Men with cracked hands drag stone and timber while coughing into sleeves. The ditch edges are sharper now, the crossings narrower, the fatigue heavier. You can tell the fort is close to finished because the walls start looking perfect, and the men start looking finished. Keane is back on the line, hauling stakes and string, watching Renwick punish inches. The shape is nearly there. The star is almost complete, and that's the moment the island chooses to take another payment. It starts small, the way most disasters start. A shortcut that feels harmless. A crossing plank is laid over a deep cut so material can move faster. It's supposed to be temporary for one night. It's supposed to be watched. It's supposed to be fine. A squad pushes a cartload of stone along it while the lantern light makes shadows lie. The plank flexes. A wheel catches. The men lean forward together instinctively and the cart jerks. The plank snaps. One man goes down into the cut, hard. The cart follows, stone spilling, pinning him at an angle that makes his scream sound wrong, as if his body can't decide whether it's lungs or bones that are breaking. Another man tries to jump back and catches his boot on the broken edge. He teeters for half a second, arms pinwheeling, then drops too. Men rush in with ropes. Somebody shouts for the medic. Somebody else shouts for more lanterns. Rennick arrives and does what he always does first. He takes control. "Rope them out," he snaps. "Quietly, and get another plank down, this line cannot stop." A rope goes down, hands grab, men haul. The first pinned worker comes up with his face grey and his legs trembling, blood leaking into sand like ink. The second one doesn't come up right. His head is at the wrong angle. His mouth opens and closes without sound. The medic tries to make him breathe. He tries to press his ribs and wake the air inside him. He looks up once, not asking permission, asking what story he's expected to tell. Renwick doesn't look down into the cut. He looks toward the shoreline, toward the dark, toward the possible silhouette of a ship that could arrive at dawn and see chaos. "Move them inside," he says. "No one outside this work line needs to see anything." 2 men carry the broken one toward the tents. The dead one is wrapped in canvas and follows. The plank gets replaced. The cart is righted. Stones are restacked. Within minutes, the fort pretends the cut never took anyone. And then the second part of the disaster arrives, because on an island, injuries aren't the end. They're openings. The pinned worker's leg swells by morning. The skin goes tight and shiny, the heat under it unnatural. The medic tries to drain it, tries to clean it, tries to fight an infection with boiled rags and willpower. It isn't enough. The fever comes on like a tide. The man starts talking to people who aren't there. He begs for water, then refuses it, then stops recognizing his own name. He dies 3 days later, not on the plank, not in the cut, but under a blanket that smells like salt and sickness. That's how the cost disappears. A fall becomes an injury becomes a fever becomes a death, and a death behind canvas becomes a line that doesn't need detail. Rennick gets his inspection anyway. The ship arrives. Men stand straighter. The work face is cleaned. The angles are presented like evidence of competence. The burial ground stays behind the tents, out of the route, driftwood markers leaned away from any eye that might count them. The inspector walks the perimeter and sees what he came to see. Symmetry, strength, control. He stands on a bastion and looks out at sea, nodding at the lines as if lines are the same thing as stability. Keane watches him and feels the bitter clarity of it. The fort's geometry is legible to a stranger in one glance. The fort's human story isn't legible at all unless someone forces it to be. The paperwork will say the build was hard but successful. It will mention storms. It will mention supply delays. It will mention losses in the abstract, the way people talk about ships and horses. And then time does what time always does. The fort gets completed. The walls harden. The star becomes sharp enough that it looks printed onto the landscape. The island's rot keeps chewing at everything softer than stone. Tents, cloth, wood markers, memory. Years later, someone will fly above it and photograph the shape. Someone will post the image and zoom in on angles and symmetry and say, "Look at that. Impossible. Hidden in plain sight." Tartaria believers will circle the points like they're touching a secret, because secrets feel better than grief. A secret suggests power. Grief suggests waste. But the darker truth is that nothing here required a forgotten civilization. It required a plan, a chain, a string line, standard angles that repeat beautifully when you force them to, and it required an isolated site where men could get sick, get crushed, get buried, and then become thin marks on thin records. The geometry stayed perfect because perfection was demanded. The cost stayed hidden because nobody demanded the names. If you're still here, subscribe, because this channel is where we keep the human cost attached to the monuments that tried to shed it. Hit like if you think impossible structures should come with the stories they swallowed, and tell me in the comments. When you see flawless geometry in the middle of nowhere, what do you trust more? Mystery, or the possibility that the real secret is simply what got buried to make it look perfect?